Hi, Founder fans, Jason here, and today's anti-founder is another British general, Sir Henry Clinton. And to help us talk about this general, let's welcome back one of our favorite guests, Michael Troy from the American Revolution podcast. Michael Troy, thank you for coming back.
Hi, Jason. Happy to be here.
Great. Well, in a weird way, I feel a little guilty that I keep asking you to talk about the British, but we are on a roll talking about the commanders of the British Army during the American Revolutionary War. And we've gotten up to Sir Henry Clinton. So let's talk a little bit about Clinton. Leading up to the Revolutionary War, he had already served around the world, essentially, if I'm not mistaken. Uh, I believe he had an important role in the 7 Years' War, as well as running Gibraltar. I don't know how to pronounce it.
Yes, he was, I think, the military governor of Gibraltar at one point.
Right, interesting.
But, yeah, I was just going to say he got started really at an early age. His father was an admiral, I believe, and ended up being governor of New York for a time. So his father actually got Henry a commission as a captain, I believe, when he was only about uh, 15 years old or something. So yeah, he got an early start there.
Pretty impressive. And we should probably note right off the bat that um, he is distantly related to the future governor of New York, George Clinton, and his brother James, but not. I think last time we said they're not going to Thanksgiving together. They're very distant cousins.
Yeah, they were fourth or fifth cousins. There's a duke or something way back, 4 or 5 generations back that is a common ancestor of theirs. Neither of them inherited the family title. They were all, second or third sons somewhere down the line in there. So they had to make their own way in life with
Right.
just lots of good connections.
Right. So let's get into the American Revolution. Now, like I said, we did kind of go over this with our previous discussions on earlier British generals, but just to get back where we were, uh, Henry Henry Clinton comes over at the same time, right after Lexington and Concord, if I'm not mistaken. Is he's one of the initial generals to come take over for General Gage?
Right. He's one of the three generals that comes over even before London's heard about Lexington. Him, William Howe, and Johnny Burgoyne all come over on the same ship together.
Right, that's right. And they show up and say, "What do you mean there was Lexington and Concord?"
Exactly. And then they immediately go off and start Bunker Hill.
Right, and they win that, but it takes a pretty heavy toll. Now, I understand for a good portion of the war, uh, um, Clinton doesn't necessarily see eye to eye with. I keep wanting to say Gage, but I mean
Howe.
Howe. Thank you. I apologize. Yeah, Clinton doesn't really see eye to eye with Howe, and I understand he spends a a good portion. He goes to New York after the siege of Boston, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, just to take a quick step back. When they
Sure.
come over, uh, already all three of them are major generals. Howe is the more senior major general. General Gage, of course, gets sent back to London relatively soon after their arrival, a few months, and Howe takes command. Now, when Gage was in charge, Howe and Clinton seemed to get along pretty well. They were both, they kind of bonded over basically attacking Howe's performance. When Howe took over, Gage, or Gage, uh, Clinton immediately started attacking Howe's performance, and Howe didn't like that too much.
Right.
So, um,
Seems to be a trend with the British officers to attack whoever's in charge.
right, you always want to undermine your superior and convince the upper folks that you can do a better job than him. So yeah, they all came down. Well, they were in Boston together. They pulled out and went up to Halifax for a few months, and then Howe was doing his invasion of New York, and Clinton was his second in command at that point. Um, Clinton, I should quick step back. He in the pre-war years and in the 7 Years' War, he did a lot of fighting in Germany with the Prussian army, and he was known as a big advocate of what was called German-style warfare, which made lots of use of flanking maneuvers and strategic. actions that would surround and capture the enemy, catch them off guard, that sort of thing. So he was a huge advocate of that sort of thing. And he had actually recommended to Howe that they try to flank the Americans on Long Island, and he was the one who recommended that they go find the Jamaica Pass and come back around behind the American flank and capture them. And Howe went along with it in that case. He didn't let Clinton lead the flanking maneuver, but he went with Clinton's advice.
And
Um,
that worked swimmingly for the British, I understand.
yeah, it worked really well. And then Clinton wanted to do the same thing again in Manhattan. He wanted to land the forces up north. The Americans were all kind of on the southern tip of Manhattan Island, where the city was at that time. Clinton wanted to land up north of where they were and cut them off from any avenue of retreat, basically get the British Army on the north of them, the British Navy to the south of them, and they'd have no choice but to surrender. And Howe refused to do that. He wanted to give the Americans an avenue of escape. He did not want a massacre. And Clinton was really upset that that was the plan.
Yeah, let's end it now.
Yeah, that was Clinton's view.
They
You go
shouldn't be
in,
revolting
hit it,
against the crown.
right. You go in, you hit them hard, and you end this thing. And Howe did not seem to want to do that. And really, you see all through the New York campaign, uh, Clinton wanting to attack, be aggressive, go after them, and Howe is just continually holding all of his generals back, not just Clinton.
Right.
Um, will not let them deal the death blow. And at one point, I think at White Plains, Clinton complains to one of his subordinates, a guy named General Cornwallis, that he says, I'd rather have the command of 3 companies than served as second to Howe a day longer, or something to that effect. Just really frustrated with what Howe was doing.
Yeah.
And Cornwallis, of course, immediately reported that to Howe, which made their relationship that much worse.
Well, some guy Cornwallis that you're referencing, he plays a pretty important role throughout the American Revolution. Also, you kind of
Well,
casually breezed by Cornwallis there.
Cornwallis was doing his job of undermining his immediate commander for personal gain, and that it worked swimmingly for him, because what happened next was, after the Americans got pushed out of New York, they had to get pushed across New Jersey, and Howe wasn't going to do that himself. He wanted to settle into New York City and enjoy some, gambling and his mistress. So he was going to send another commander out to push them across New Jersey, and the logical choice to do that would have been Clinton. Instead, he gave that command to Cornwallis and told Clinton to go secure Newport, Rhode Island.
Right. And so Clinton does this, and Rhode Island, Newport, I understand, was fairly easy to secure without much generaling to do, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it's a bunch of Quakers. They were
Right.
really not a hard bunch to knock over. Um, Howe wanted to have a port in New England, ostensibly because New York could possibly freeze over in the winter, and Newport was more of a saltwater port that was less likely to freeze over. It also gave him a toehold in New England.
And the
So that
Patriots
was all
had
good.
Boston.
Right, right. You're just a few days march from Boston at that point. Um, the problem was Howe did not give Clinton nearly enough troops to do anything except take Aquidneck Island, which is where the city of Newport sits. And he couldn't really get to the mainland because he didn't have enough troops. But again, almost as soon as Clinton goes, and I think he had 5 or 6 thousand troops. Howe immediately takes some of those troops back after Newport is secured, and then he starts sending letters to Clinton on a regular basis saying, "Why aren't you doing more? Why aren't you pushing harder? Why are you sitting on your ass, not getting anything done?" And Clinton realizes that he's being set up for failure, that Howe is looking to destroy him by saying, "Look, you're not doing anything." Um,
He's like building an alibi.
Right. He's basically saying this is a do nothing general who's all talk and no action. So Clinton decides to just leave Newport. He leaves his second in command in charge and heads back to London, where he's going to resign.
Right. And he gets to London and tries to resign. We were talking a little bit about this before we turned on the camera. He goes in to resign, and what does King and Country do for him?
Yeah, the administration really doesn't want to let Clinton go. He's a good officer. Everybody knows he's one of their top generals, and a lot of them actually have more faith in him than in Howe at the moment. But they're not quite ready to replace Howe either. But they refuse to accept his resignation. They give him a whole bunch of awards and tell him what a wonderful guy he is. They grant him a knighthood, an Order of the Bath, and they send him back to New York and say, "Yeah, you still got to be Howe's second in command."
Yeah, they make him Sir Henry Clinton. And
Yep.
he's like, I can't say no to that. And he does. So he returns to New York. No more sitting around in Newport for him. Instead, it turns into sitting around in New York City.
Right. And one thing I did gloss over, which we should mention too, even before they invade New York, Clinton did actually get an independent command. He was supposed to go down and take Charleston, South Carolina. He went down with Sir Peter Parker, who was a naval officer, and they tried to take Fort Moultrie, and that's kind of a famous battle too, where Charles Lee is in command, and General Moultrie is holding the Fort Moultrie, which is on an island in Charleston Harbor. And the British just have the worst time there. They try to bombard the fort, which is made with these green palmetto logs, so the cannonballs just kind of sink into the walls and do nothing.
Right.
They try to get around to the back of the fort where the Patriots still haven't built a wall, and they can't seem to get there. They get stuck on a sandbar, and it just becomes a complete disaster, and they have to give up and return back to New York for
I'm
the
glad.
invasion of Long Island.
Yeah, I'm glad you
So
brought that up because that's where South Carolina gets its flag, the Moultrie flag, and the name the Palmetto State. I understand.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, absolutely.
So very
Yeah, no,
important.
it was a really big event, and it also made part of Charles Lee's reputation as a general because he was the American commander there, even though General Moultrie was defying General Lee's orders by keeping the fort. Lee wanted to retreat before the British even got there.
Right.
But
Lee,
anyway,
yeah, Lee and Gates, they get a lot of things. They get a lot of good luck for doing things pretty wrong throughout the war.
so yeah, so anyway, I only mentioned that mostly because Clinton really thought that that event destroyed his reputation, that no one was ever going to trust him with an independent command again. He had blown this one, and
Right.
he spent the next year basically trying to pass blame over to Admiral Parker for the whole event,
And
and
was
just
that
he
before or
could not let
after
it
he
go.
went to Newport?
This was before even the invasion of New York. This was in early 1776.
That's right, because Lee goes
So
back for New York, if I'm not
right.
mistaken. Yeah.
They sent Clinton down there. First, he was going to capture all of the Carolinas. Then they gave up on that. That he was just going to capture this dinky little island in Charleston Harbor, and he couldn't even accomplish that. And then he had to get back in time for the invasion of New York. So it was a complete bust for him, and he was very, very unhappy about that. And
Yeah.
of course, then he had his frustrations with Howe at New York, and then he got banished to Newport,
Yeah.
went home to quit, and then came back and now we're back to him being second in command in New York at the time when General Howe is personally leading the invasion of Philadelphia. He's going all the way down to the Chesapeake Bay and then marching north to take Philadelphia. And he leaves his second in command, Clinton, cooling his heels in New York, babysitting a bunch of Tories and uh, Hessians who basically are sitting there doing nothing.
Yeah. A small group of Tories in Hessian.
Yeah, it was a few thousand men, and you're
Right.
talking about many hundreds of square miles of territory that they had to defend, so that he was pretty spread out. And this is the same time when we've got General Burgoyne, who's marching down through upstate New York, trying to get from Quebec to New York City, kind of gets stuck at Saratoga. And
Right. And now with the invasion from the north of the Saratoga campaign by Burgoyne, a lot of times studying Revolutionary history, you hear how he expected General Howe to send soldiers up north the Hudson so they could meet in the middle. And there was also a third prong. The gentleman's name escapes me, coming down from Oswego, uh, or Lake Ontario, I mean. But even though we often get the impression that no one was sent to help, General Clinton actually, with the meager soldiers he had, did attempt to help Burgoyne invade Saratoga, essentially.
yeah,
That's where we get the Battle of the Clintons.
Right, the Battle of the Clintons, where Henry Clinton fights George Clinton and James Clinton at Fort Clinton, which is a little bit up the Hudson River. Um,
But he also
Henry,
doesn't he burn? Is it Kingston or
yeah,
yeah? So
Sir Henry takes a small troop of about 2,000 soldiers up the Hudson River from New York City, takes Fort Clinton and another fort, Fort Montgomery, which is right across the river from Fort Clinton. Then sails a little bit further up to where will be the future site of West Point. At that point, there's a small fort there called Fort Constitution. He takes that. The idea is he's trying to distract the Continental Army that's facing Burgoyne and force them to turn around and fight him a little bit. The problem is he's got too few men and he really can't march deep enough into Continental territory without really endangering his own lines and suffering the same fate as Burgoyne. He does get as far as Kingston, which is the capital of New York at the time, and burns it to the ground. He's looking to hold these areas and try to see if he can push a little harder when he gets a note from General Howe saying, hey, don't know what you're up to these days, but please send half your soldiers down to Philadelphia. So even though he's understaffed at the moment, he's forced to send even more soldiers down to New York. And of course, Clinton sees this as a personal attempt to destroy
right,
any effort to let him have a success. Um,
it's Newport all over again.
right. So he has to basically pull back all of his men, give up the remains. Well, they burn Fort Clinton, they burn Fort Montgomery, they burn Fort Constitution, and pull back to New York City, having accomplished nothing.
I mean, they burned New York's capital. Like that's not nothing to snuff at. At the same time, Philadelphia's getting taken over. They destroy New York's capital, have New York City. I mean, Newport isn't Rhode Island's capital. I think Providence is the capital at that point, but one of the two cities in Rhode Island. Like
Yeah, I mean, it was a small raid, but his real goal in making that raid was to save Burgoyne's army. He
right,
failed in that regard.
right. For unfortunately for him. So he goes back to New York and he's there for a little while, but then suddenly General Howe, as we discussed last time, decides to resign.
Yeah, General Howe resigns in, I think, towards the very end of 1777, sends his resignation. It's not actually accepted until a few months later, and he doesn't depart Pennsylvania until I want to say March of 78, just a month or two before they abandon the city. So Clinton comes down from New York. He gets word that Howe's being recalled and that he's being put in command and that he needs to go down to Philadelphia and assume command of the army. You'd think this would be a happy time for him, except for the other orders he received at the same time, which is, oh, by the way, France has entered the war. We really don't care about North America that much anymore. And you need to send half of your army to the Caribbean and to Florida and to some other parts of the empire. So, of
So
course,
Howe's
Howe was
gone, and the
complaining.
British government does to him what Howe had been doing the whole
Right,
time, taking away his forces.
right. Howe had been complaining for a year now that he didn't have enough troops, and now Clinton was going to have half as many troops as Howe did. So he's actually under orders to abandon Philadelphia, to surrender it to the rebels and return back to New York, which he's very upset about.
Right.
It doesn't help at all that the Carlisle Peace Commission shows up in Philadelphia about a few weeks before they're getting ready to leave and says, "You've got to be kidding me. How is this happening? Um, we came here under the assurance that Britain was going to put up a position of strength so that we could negotiate a peace. And can't you just stay for even a couple weeks to let us try to negotiate something before we cut and run?" And Clinton's like, "Nope, sorry, under orders, got to go." And it wasn't just a blind following of orders. They were afraid that the French fleet was going to show up at the mouth of the Delaware River at some point and trap them in Philadelphia. And
Right.
then they could suffer the same fate as Burgoyne, just be completely captured. So he needed to get out of there and get back to New York. And he actually had orders from London in his discretion to give up New York as well and retreat to Halifax. He did not use that discretion. He decided to stay and hold New York. But that was kind of the feeling in London at the time is, yeah, we're just giving up on the colonies for now. We don't care about them anymore. We got more important things to fight about.
Right. And I do want to note you brought up the Carlisle Peace Commission, and this was a handful of members of Parliament, or most of them at least, I believe, who were essentially given the right not to just to negotiate peace, but it was basically everything but independence was on the table.
Yeah, Britain really panicked after France got in the war because they realized they were behind the eight ball. They realized that they were already in debt. They had already sent all their troops to America. They really didn't have an army much to speak of in England anymore. Uh, France had just built this huge navy that was really going to compete with the British Navy, and they risked not only losing America, which were not really that important to the British Empire overall, but they were much more concerned about losing Caribbean islands like Jamaica and Barbados and places like that, which were real money makers for the British Empire. They made a lot of money there because they produced tons of sugar, which was an extremely valuable crop, and of course, slaves were making it. Also, it didn't cost them anything to make it.
Right.
Um,
Most of the things in North America could either be replaced there or were lumber.
yeah, the stuff that America made was just not really that important to the empire. It could be produced just about anywhere, and it was not nearly as profitable because, let's face it, you had white colonists there who took most of the profit, unlike the slaves in Bermuda that
Right.
worked for nothing.
Right.
Literally.
And yeah, there were very few comparatively free people in the Caribbean compared to
Yeah,
most of the
a lot of those
colonies.
islands were like 95, 98% black slaves.
Right, exactly.
That was it.
Yeah, even in the deeper parts of the South, there were still gigantic segment of the population. Don't get me wrong, but
Yeah, South Carolina had the highest percentage slave population. I think it was just over half.
okay, interesting. That's a fun fact. I did not know that. So anyway, back to Clinton. Clinton now finds himself with half an army, a peace commission that doesn't have anything to do, and he's bailing on the capital that was just conquered. What is his
Yeah,
first step after this?
yeah. So yeah, just to follow up with the peace commission, I said they were desperate. What
Oh,
you said was right. They gave the commissioners carte blanche to give everything to the Americans. We will repeal every single tax since the 7 Years' War. We will repeal every single law since the 7 Years' War that you don't like. We will allow you to set up your own Continental Congress, which will be
if I'm not mistaken, it was really similar to the Galloway plan from the first Continental Congress.
yeah,
Not exactly the same, but basically America would set up its own parliament, and like they would have a veto on Parliament. Parliament would have a veto on Continental Congress, something along those lines.
well, essentially, yeah, Continental Congress would operate independently of Parliament and be under the authority of the King and the Privy Council, just like Parliament was under the authority of the King and the Privy Council. So it was essentially full independence. It was if this offer had come 2 years earlier, there would have been dancing in the streets. The Americans would have said, "Hooray for the King! We love you. You're a defender of our liberties. You know,
It
thank you.
sounds
We'll be British subjects forever."
Yeah, it sounds strange to say, but it's almost like Canada's current relationship with England, where like because the
Yeah,
Queen of England is still on the money in Canada.
yeah. The king in that case, now queen, was not quite as much of a figurehead as she is today. They
Sure.
probably would have had a little bit more control. They would have still controlled trade within the empire, so they would restrict how Americans could trade and things like that. But
But the colonists
as I
didn't have
said,
a problem with that.
right, they were willing to give them everything they asked
Yeah,
for. They really wanted to do this because they wanted to secure the colonies. They didn't care about North America. They wanted to focus on the French and the West Indies, or
yeah.
what we call the Caribbean today. Uh, so they were willing to give everything, and the Americans said, "Yeah, no, it's too late.
Too late.
Sorry, we're independent. We just got this huge ally in France, and you're telling us now that we still should go back and submit to the king." And 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 they knew. I mean, it wasn't just bragging or something. It was a question of, yes, Britain's giving all this stuff to us now, but what's going to happen 10 years from now when we're not really in a position anymore? We don't trust you. You screwed us too many times. We don't trust you to be our government anymore. So we're independent now. Sorry.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it came to nothing. So
Stuck
now,
being a
yeah,
republic. Ugh.
yeah. So yeah, now Clinton is in New York with a much smaller military force, and he's under orders to do nothing. They say do not try to engage in any offensive actions. Don't you know attack. Um, he goes out on a few foraging raids and things like that, but really nothing significant. The only thing that London still hopes to do is maybe peel off a few of the southern colonies because they think there's a much larger loyalist population in the south, and they're much more lightly populated, so their armies can have more of an effect.
Right.
So in
And
17,
I'm
end of
sorry, I
17,
didn't mean to interrupt.
sorry, I was going to say, the end of 1778, Clinton deploys a force of, I think, about 2,000 soldiers to take Savannah, Georgia, and
And
they do
that launches the Southern strategy as it's come to be known.
right. They effectively take back Savannah and basically claim royal control over the entire state again. The commander who takes the victory there, Colonel Campbell, claims he's the first British officer to remove a star and a stripe from the American flag, that they've made Georgia part of the British Empire again. And you remember that Florida was also under royal control at this time, but they only had a few hundred soldiers there.
Right. But
So
Florida never joined the team,
Florida never joined the
the
rebellion.
Continental Army. I mean, and
Right.
and technically, East and West Florida were two different colonies. So sparsely populated Georgia was not only, like you said, very loyalist. They had a lot of not only loyalist problems, but deep divisions within the rebel community itself. So it was
Yeah, Georgia only had about 30,000 people living in it at the time, and almost half of them were slaves. And of course, a half of the white people were women, and probably another half of the men were underage. So you're getting to a relatively small number of fighting age men there.
right.
Florida was even smaller. East Florida, I think at the time, only had less than 1,000 white men living there.
Right. Well, Florida
Um,
was almost uninhabitable because
right.
malaria and just the climate and
Well, Florida
swamps and
had been
alligators.
Spanish until the Seven Years' War. At the end of the Seven Years' War, Spain gave Florida to Britain in exchange for Cuba, which Britain had captured during the war. So uh, Britain took control of East and West Florida. Just so you know, East Florida, we're talking about basically all of what we consider today Florida, that huge peninsula.
Right.
West Florida is that little part of the Gulf Coast that is today the Panhandle, and it was also part of southern Mississippi and Alabama.
Yeah.
That was West Florida. Um, East Florida was the part that was fighting against Georgia for the first part of the war. They were back and forth. That was the battle lines between the British and the Patriots. And as I said, there were almost nobody in Florida, so the very few that lived there. When Spain left Florida, literally every single Spanish person left Florida that was there. There were, I, I think there were 6 Spanish people who remained in East Florida.
That's incredible.
Yeah, so it was just everybody left. So yeah, a few hundred British people got there. Um, they had a bunch of slaves, but uh, there was really nothing going on because, as you said, it was a miserable place to live. It was a
Right.
swamp. Most of the
And
people who went
and
there
the
died within a year of some tropical disease. It
right,
was
and
just
the
awful.
Seminole Indians, Native Americans, were fairly hostile. I'm under the impression.
The Seminole were actually fairly friendly to the British.
Okay.
It was the Creek Indians were very hostile to
Right.
them, that they had to deal with that. The Seminole they generally got along with, but as I
I
said,
might
it
have been
was
associating that with the wars later with Andrew Jackson, has
the
perhaps
Seminole
tainted
were
my
always
memory.
very hostile to America because they were on the British side during the American Revolution. which meant when the British left, the Seminole were left to face America on their own.
Right. Very interesting. So let's steer ourselves back to Sir Henry Clay. We've gotten a little off course. That's all right. It's a lot of fun.
So Sir Henry takes Savannah.
Savannah, and
He's
then
begun the Southern campaign.
keeps going.
So right, they take Savannah and they hold that for about a year. They're doing some fighting down in the Caribbean. They capture um, Saint Lucia from the French. They lose the island of Domingo to the French, so they're kind of battling back and forth down there over the Sugar Islands, which is what they really care about. But they do decide they make a few attacks on South Carolina, and eventually um, Clinton decides that he wants to redeem himself for his failure to take Charleston those many years earlier. And in 1780, it might be 81. I think it's 1780. He returns with a force of about 14,000 men, which is just about every single man he had in North America at that point, and he takes Charleston and personally leads the attack and captures an army of about 5,000 under General Benjamin Lincoln. And it's one of the biggest American defeats of the entire war in terms of loss of men as prisoners. But Clinton takes back Charleston and is very happy with himself at that point. So at that point, he leaves his subordinate general, this guy named Cornwallis, in charge.
Guy.
Yeah, that guy, that same guy who's always popping up somewhere. Cornwallis is left in charge of the Southern Command. Clinton returns to New York and to his mistress and all that good stuff. And because they all do,
Yeah, it's like to be a major, to be commander of the British Army, you need to have a mistress in New York. Seemed to me.
Yeah, well, it's actually his mistress is actually a little bit interesting. It was a woman who was the wife of a British officer, and
wasn't Howes also the wife of a British? Oh no, yes. Howes was the wife of a.
Yeah, Howes was the wife of. Well, I believe he was an officer. He was in charge of the prisoners. I know that. I believe he held a commission.
Right.
But this guy was an officer too, and some other officer had hit on his wife, and she wouldn't sleep with him, and so he got demoted. And then she ended up working as a housekeeper for Clinton. And apparently in Boston, this was when they're still in Boston, and Clinton apparently hit on her, but she refused to have anything to do with him in that way. They kind of became friends, but that was really the extent of it. And then after they moved to New York, she learned that her husband was cheating on her. And so she said, well, screw this. I'm having an affair with Clinton.
Well, that makes everything okay then.
Right. So then he finally got his mistress. So he was.
And then he gets promoted to major to commander in chief. So,
so everything's good, right? And at this point, Clinton's wife is dead. His wife died before the war actually began. Yeah, he actually married his first wife in what I'm pretty sure was a shotgun marriage. She was a woman who was a little bit above his station, and she had a child about 6 months after they were married.
Oh, so, excellent. Well, yeah, that's how you make your way up in old-timey British politics.
And he just kept at her because they had 5 kids in 5 years until she died in childbirth. So
okay,
kind of a sad story, but
well, now he's got his scions, I suppose.
So yeah, he's got his heirs.
Yeah,
and then he goes off to get a little something on the side during the war.
Right.
So anyway, he's back in New York, enjoying the good life of a commanding general, and leaving General Cornwallis in charge of the Carolinas. And of course, Cornwallis spends the next year and a half trying to conquer the Carolinas and Virginia.
Yeah, he does a very good job.
He does a pretty good job. He takes most of the Carolinas.
Yeah, he chases the Virginia government out of Richmond. I mean, I know Benedict Arnold was the one doing most of that chasing, but
Yeah, well, he was working with them, but
Yeah, that was under Clinton's. I'm sorry, Cornwallis's greater authority.
right, and he had General Bannister Tarleton with him, who was also a big help.
Right.
Uh, so yeah, they're doing a pretty good job of it. Um,
And
but
Clinton sits it out. Essentially, he just stays in New York and lets Cornwallis do all the dirty work.
right, he's letting Cornwallis do his own thing, and this is actually another place where politics gets messes everything up. Our old favorite Secretary of State, Lord Germain, who seems to hate everyone, of course, has a feud with Clinton going on as well. And he tells Cornwallis that Cornwallis is essentially an independent command and he doesn't have to listen to Clinton anymore and he can just do whatever he wants. And of course, that really ticks off Clinton, and they're trying to deal with all this without it becoming open warfare between officials and stuff. But right, essentially, Cornwallis has command to do whatever he wants, and the Americans send down their best general to take him on, Horatio Gates. He just stomps Gates pretty
Best.
quickly. Well, he's the most senior general. He's the one that everybody thought should be replacing Washington at one point, and he's Washington, of course, is like, okay, Gates, you think you're so great? Go prove yourself. Win the South back.
Yeah. What?
He gets
Yeah,
creamed.
just like Saratoga, but this time you're fighting against Benedict Arnold. Good luck, man.
Yeah, none of Benedict Arnold to bail you out this time.
Yeah.
In fact, he's fighting against you. But Gates literally loses the Battle of Camden and then rides back to Philadelphia overnight, galloping on his horse several hundred miles because he wants to be there to tell Congress what happened and give his side of the story rather than hear it from somebody else. But in doing so, he essentially abandons his entire army. And that's a big no-no for a military commander. And
For
so
the
that's
best. Yeah.
yeah, that's really the end of Gates. At that point, Congress says,
Yeah.
"Yeah, you moron! You don't not only lose a battle, but then you abandon your army to come give some spin to us. Come on!"
Yeah.
So they send Nathaniel Greene down to deal with Cornwallis at that point, and
Who?
that's where Nathaniel Greene really earns his chops, where he really
Right.
builds his reputation as a commander.
When you said best commander, I thought the name you were going to say was Nathaniel Greene, and just skip over Horatio Gates because, from in my perspective, Nathaniel Greene is, when it comes to the army itself, is the underrated founder. He's the guy who essentially wins the war. Like,
Yeah, he really wins it in the South.
yeah,
He's had mixed results in the North. He was never really given a chance to get an independent command.
right,
Washington forces him to become quartermaster for a year or two, which nobody wanted to do. It's a completely thankless position.
right.
Um, and I mean, even if you had food, which they never did, nobody praises you for getting the meals to the soldiers on time.
Right.
So yeah, he was in a very thankless position, and Washington decides, well, all right, I'm going to give you your big chance, and he does an amazing job. He goes down and he fights a couple of battles with Cornwallis that people at West Point still study to this day. He
Right.
just really does some amazing stuff. Um,
He definitely gets
manages to,
help along the way. Shout out to Francis Marion and
oh yeah,
several other people. But, like we were saying, Cornwallis had essentially gone from Georgia up through Virginia. And Nathaniel Greene, a year and a half, less than a year later, has him cornered at Yorktown. Like,
well, yeah, Cornwallis has only taken the Carolinas by this point. He hasn't taken Virginia until Greene gets there. And what Greene does is Greene loses most of the battles he fights against Cornwallis, but what he's doing strategically the whole time is forcing Cornwallis to chase him and pulling Cornwallis farther and farther away from his supply lines. And eventually they get into southern Georgia, what's called the Race for the Dan, and they're fighting their way through Virginia. And suddenly Cornwallis realizes that he's hundreds and hundreds of miles away from his base of operation, that he lacks supplies, and that the only way he's going to get out of this mess is for the British fleet to come pick him up in Yorktown and get him out of there. And of course, Clinton sends the British fleet down. They go up against the French fleet and decide, yeah, we're not going to be able to do this. And they turn around and leave leave poor Cornwallis kind of uh, fly, floating in the wind there at Yorktown with no means of escape.
Yeah, because the new French Navy we were discussing is hard to take on when most of the British Navy is distracted elsewhere.
Right, most of the British Navy is in other parts of the empire. They most certainly do not control the seas anymore, especially when the French decide to send a fleet over. The French didn't have fleet over here that often, but this was a case of very good timing. And Washington marches his main army down from New York to participate with General Greene. So you have the confluence of Washington's Northern Army, Greene's Southern Army, and the French fleet all surrounding Cornwallis at just the right time, and Cornwallis really has no choice but to surrender.
Right. And we should give a shout out to the Spanish, who themselves are distracting the British, not just in the deep South, but the Caribbean itself as well.
Yeah, the Spanish are helping to distract the British.
They're a small part, but they're there.
I think the Spanish are overrated, at least as far as they're being portrayed as friends of the American Revolution.
Oh,
The Spanish never made an alliance with America. They never uh, fought on American soil to try to do anything to help the Continental Army in any way. They could not. They didn't even actually send an official ambassador to America during this time. It was more of a the enemy of an enemy is my friend. It was kind of like America and Russia were during World War II. Yeah, we both really hate the Nazis, but we're not crazy about each other either.
right. We're
Um,
not going to parties together.
so, but right, Spain was trying to take some islands in the Caribbean. They were really fighting to take back West Florida, and that's where you have Galvez doing a lot of stuff.
Right.
They did also want to take back East Florida. So the British had to deploy troops to those areas, and of course
Right.
that's watering down who they had left to fight the Americans. And their credit where credit is due, the Americans did need some cash to pay their army at Yorktown, which was really fed up by this time, and the soldiers were literally ready to mutiny and go home.
There
They'd
were
actually tried.
mutinies.
They had tried several times already.
Yeah.
Um,
George Washington had to get rid of a few people.
but the only way that Washington could convince most of his army to march down to Yorktown was to give them some gold and silver. They weren't taking this toilet paper money anymore that Continental Congress kept spitting out. Uh, France actually went down and made a deal with the governor of Cuba, which was a Spanish official at the time, to front the money that Washington used to pay his army to go to Yorktown. So, in a very indirect way, they were critical to getting the American army to Yorktown for that final victory.
So I'm unaware of that. So let's just recap that. The French sailed to Spanish-held Cuba, took gold from the Spanish, and sailed it to, I would say, York. Like, did he meet? They would have met them at Yorktown, I presume.
Yeah, I don't think they took it all the way up to New York, but they got word that, if you get to Yorktown, you get your gold. So that gave the men the incentive to make the march.
Yeah, I'm curious if it was because obviously it wasn't the Spanish king. I'm curious if it was the Spanish, like a private citizens in Cuba, or if it was like the royal
No, I
governors.
think, I think it was the governor.
Really?
And France and Spain were very close. As much as Spain wasn't particularly friendly with the U.S., they were very friendly with France. And they often made deals like this because Spain had lots of hard money in the Americas because they had all those gold and silver mines that their slaves were digging up for them in Central and South America. So it was very easy to get a hold of hard currency from the Spanish
Right.
in America, and then France would just pay them back in Europe. So that way you didn't have to worry about transferring the money across the ocean. So that was kind of a common practice between those two
Interesting.
countries.
Because the
But
Spanish dollar was like almost like the U.S. dollar is today to the world. Spanish dollar was
certainly in the Americas, it was the
yeah,
currency of choice, even in British North America
right.
and in French America as well. Um, because right, it was a known quantity of solid silver. Everybody knew exactly what it was and what it was worth, and it could easily be broken into 8 pieces, which is where we get the term pieces of 8. Um, so yeah, it was a very common currency in existence for several centuries, and as I said, the French very frequently borrowed from the Spanish in America and then paid them back in Europe.
That's amazing. So I do want to steer the conversation back to our subject, Henry Clinton. I
We do
love
get
these
distracted
detours,
that
though.
way.
That is extremely fascinating. But steering back to Henry Clinton, uh, Cornwallis is captured at Yorktown. He's in New York. I assume he finds out that this happens, and he realize the war is over with the capture of Cornwallis?
Yeah, I think everybody kind of realized it was even pretty much over before Yorktown, and that was just the final blow.
Right.
Uh, you know, that was
So,
the
so does Clinton remain in New York?
not for very long, because as soon as London hears about the loss in Yorktown, they recall Clinton.
Oh, they recall him, you said?
Yeah, he has to go back to London
Okay.
and
And
explain
who does
himself.
he leave in charge of New York until the evacuation?
The London appoints the next most senior general in North America, which is Guy Carleton.
Oh, up in Canada.
Guy Carleton is in Quebec at the time, and he comes down to New York to take command.
Just sit there and wait, essentially.
Well, right.
Well,
I mean, this
I
is
shouldn't
early
say that.
1982, and the war doesn't end until 1784. So it's a good year and a half, maybe almost 2 years of just kind of sitting around waiting for the diplomats to come up with a final agreement on the war. But you're right. Major operations are over at that point.
Right. And that was a
Even
generalization. There are obviously skirmishes, people die, and you don't want to I shouldn't have glossed over that so flippantly.
No, but most people consider Yorktown the end of the war because it did determine the outcome of the war. At that point, they were really just trying to decide what the details would be. And most of the fighting that you see after that time is fighting on the periphery. A lot of the Northwest Territory, because it's unclear whether that's going to be British or American in the treaty, and also down in Florida, it's unclear exactly how much the British are going to give back as far as Georgia and the Carolinas and all that.
Right.
Um,
That's true.
so yeah, there is still some, I'll call it skirmishing, that's going on over that year while Carleton is in command of America. But the war is over. Uh, the Americans send diplomats. Well, I guess they already have diplomats in France. The British send diplomats over to France to really hammer out an agreement and put this war to an end. Meanwhile, Clinton has to go back to London and explain how he lost this whole army under Cornwallis and why he's not a complete failure that everybody should hate. And as I said, Clinton was always very um, defensive and insecure about his military reputation. And of course, this did nothing to help it. So he really spends the next year or two doing everything he can to convince everyone in London that this was really Cornwallis's fault and not his. He even writes a book on the matter. Um,
Right. I was
he
going to ask
still
you about that. He actually publishes a book about it's not the whole war, it's just essentially
no, it's
Cornwallis's
just the Southern campaign. It's
just
just
Cornwallis. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So right, he writes this whole book basically explaining why it's all Cornwallis's fault. He still has a seat in Parliament at this point, so he has a little bit of political power, although he actually loses his seat in 1784. Uh, so uh,
So
he's
he was
really
actually a
become just
member of the
not a
government
non-god at that point.
this entire
Huh?
time.
What?
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I was just saying he was technically a member of the government the entire time he's in America.
Yeah, he won a seat in Parliament in like I think the late 1760s, and even before the war, he never sat in Parliament. He held the seat, but he actually spent most of his time as a parliamentarian in continental Europe, um, uh, checking out the armies there and being kind of a military guy and chatting with other European officers and learning more about what they're doing, that sort of thing. He never he really had no interest in operating as a politician.
Right.
So
Well, that's one of the reasons he seemed like such a good choice for being at if not the head of, at the top of the Army in America. I mean, he had spent a whole career studying different methods of warfare. Like you said from the beginning, he had the right idea coming into the Battle of Brooklyn.
Yeah, everybody in the Western world thought the Prussian army was by far the best army in terms of training and strategy and all that. And Clinton had spent years fighting in the Prussian army under, Prussian leaders, and knew everything the Prussians do very well, and so he was highly respected because of that.
Yeah.
Didn't help him any.
No. And that's a pretty good recap of the life of Sir Henry Clinton. We took a few amazing detours along the way.
Yeah, just to finish off his life real quick.
Please.
He doesn't. As I said, he kind of disappears after 1784. Doesn't do a whole lot, and then in 1790, he gets reelected to Parliament. He has a cousin who essentially controls a seat in the House of Commons and gives it to Clinton. And a few years later, Britain goes to war with France, and Clinton gets promoted to full general. Finally, he becomes what we would today call a four-star general.
Okay, so he had been a major general throughout this
He,
time.
he was a lieutenant general.
Okay.
Major general is 2 stars, lieutenant general is 3 stars, general is 4 stars.
Okay, I didn't know if Britain operated the same way as we do in the
Well,
States.
they didn't use the stars. I'm making that part.
No,
up,
okay, fair enough.
They did call it major general, lieutenant general, and general.
And general, okay, interesting, because George Washington was general, but the United States, the Continental Army, never had any lieutenant generals.
Right. They just call Washington general or general of the army.
Right.
He, the American army was never large enough to justify having a third tier of generals. So
Right.
they had the commander, and they had major generals and brigadier generals.
Fair enough.
So yeah, we didn't develop the lieutenant generals and the 4-star generals until
things got serious.
yeah, I don't think we had lieutenant generals until the Civil War, or maybe just before it. It wasn't.
Oh, I mean, I'm not an expert on that at all, but I thought it was even later than that. Because I'm under the impression, was it during World War II that they actually gave George Washington 6 stars?
Yeah, they did have 4-star generals in the Civil War. So,
I mean later, like the 1900s, they made
right.
Washington the only.
During World War II,
Okay.
was the first time we had 5-star generals, which was above general. It was called the general of the army, and that was the first time that. Well, okay, I'm going to take it one quick step back. General Pershing was given the title general of the armies, but there was never a star rank given to him.
Okay.
That was World War One, but World War II, they officially had 5-star generals. They were called generals of the army. In Europe, they would have been called field marshals. The interesting story I've heard, I don't know if it's true or not, but the reason that America didn't call it field marshal was that one of the people that was going to become one of the first 5-star generals was John Marshall.
John Marshall.
We're going to call him Field Marshal Marshall. So
That's funny.
I don't know if that's true or not, but anyway, so they had 5-star generals at that point, and they're thinking, well, heck, Washington was really just a 3-star general. That doesn't seem fair. So Congress said that he's posthumously promoted to general of the armies, kind of given a 6th star, although that's kind of unofficial whether the
Right.
6 stars design actually really exists or not. And there's also part of the law states that if America ever makes a higher rank than 5-star general, Washington will automatically supersede that. He'll
Right.
automatically be given a promotion above whoever else.
Right, because you can't have all these other guys. I mean, heroic as they may have been, you can't have, like you said, Washington's a 3-star general. You have all these 5-star generals. That's what I understood about the 6 stars. Like, it's not really a thing, but they did that to make sure no one ever outranks General Washington.
Right. As a matter of law, no one can ever rank him, because even if they create a 6 star at some point, Washington will then be a 7-star general.
Right. And I can't think of a better way to end a conversation about General Henry Clinton than talking about General George Washington. So, Michael, thank you so much for coming. Obviously,
Well, before we give up, I just want to give Clinton is due. He does become governor of Gibraltar at the very end of his life.
Oh, again?
Yeah, he's this is during the war with France, and Gibraltar becomes an important place, and he's given military command of that at the very end of his life. He actually does not assume command at that point because he dies before he can actually make it to Gibraltar.
Oh,
So,
lame.
sorry, I'm going to finish him off on that sad note, but
That's a
that's really
bummer. That's a bummer. But at least he got the appointment. I suppose that means his reputation was fully revived.
rehabilitated,
Yeah, maybe.
restored, revived.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he was kind of put in the doghouse, but people still respected him as a military commander. And you see a lot of British generals who kind of got sidelined after the loss of the American Revolution being brought back when they go to war with France in the 1790s, and Clinton's one of them.
Awesome. Michael, thank you so much for being here. This was a lot of fun. I know you'll be back real soon.
Look forward to it.
Yeah. Founder fans, link in the description to the American Revolution podcast. If you haven't listened to it, go to the beginning and spend the next several days, weeks of your life catching up because it is fantastic. Michael, thank you again. And I'll be back with another founder for you guys tomorrow.